Duncan McNabb here, Sunday the 17th of February 2025. I was recently in Bangkok and stumbled upon something new in a story that I had done quite a number of years ago. The story is that of the disappearance of young Australian financier Tim Gatland. He disappeared in Bangkok in the most mysterious of circumstances back in 1996. Now, there's a few recent bits and pieces have rekindled my interest in what is a bizarre story. As a mate of mine said, you couldn't make this sort of stuff up, and that is precisely what the disappearance of Tim Gatland is like. My interest in the story started back when I was working in television. We were looking around for an intriguing yarn to tell, and our executive producer saw this one little par in the Sunday newspaper: Tim Gatland, Australian bloke, disappears in Bangkok. Here's a financier. I started looking at it, and everywhere I went, the story became more and more intriguing. And the reality of the story is that Tim Gatland was a nice young bloke from Sydney's genteel North Shore. He moved across into the city and moved into the finance market. He was renting a spectacular apartment in Sydney's Darling Point Harbour views for days. He was living a lifestyle of the rich and famous. He had fast cars, fast friends, champagne lifestyle, the envy of many, many people. But what Tim was doing, and this is an allegation I hasten to add, Tim was very good at inveigling money out of investors on the promise of great returns. But the problem with Tim is that they weren't getting the returns. It would appear that Tim may have been sequestering the funds for his own use more than anything else, and he was supporting an expensive lifestyle. There is a great photograph of him taken at Sydney's Quay restaurant, which is on the harbour front overlooking Circular Quay, hence the name, and the Sydney Opera House. It is one of the greatest restaurants in the world even now. And the photograph is of the well-dressed young Tim Gatland leaning on a blood-red Ferrari at the front door of this place, and draped languidly over him is a beautiful young woman. Now, as I dug deeper and deeper into the story, it would seem that both the car and the young woman were rented for the purpose of that photograph. Tim was all show, not much substance, but one of the companies with which he was involved, an investment company, eventually ended up 50 million bucks in the hole and only about 27, 28 million bucks in assets. Tim left Australia very, very quickly, leaving bewildered colleagues at the companies he'd been involved in, dealing with all manner of problems, probably caused by Tim, unknowingly to them, of course. And of course, investors who are also wondering where their money had gone to, and these are mum and dad investors, small people just think they're doing the right thing with an investment. Gatland went to Bangkok, where he soon became involved with some very, very dodgy people, and they included people like Adnan Khashoggi, the Saudi Arabian arms dealer, who was embroiled in the Iran-Contra deals that many remember from years and years ago. Khashoggi was an absolute disreputable character. There were dodgy Russian bankers who were fronting banks that were purportedly run as money launderies, for the Russian mafia. And there was, most importantly, a bloke called Rakesh Saxena. Now, Saxena was involved in the Bangkok Bank of Commerce and other businesses in Thailand. Now, the Bangkok Bank of Commerce went broke, thanks to Saxena and the loans that he and his colleagues were making to pretty much anybody, and often to themselves, loans that would never ever be repaid. Hundreds of millions of dollars left the bank. The total cost of the Thai economy was estimated to be around about up to $4 billion US. It prompted one of the catalysts for the great meltdown in Southeast Asia in the late 1990s. I remember being in Bangkok around about the time this was all happening, and the BTS SkyTrain, which now zooms around the city quite effectively, was literally concrete pylons in the ground that they couldn't finish the train because the money had run out. Thailand was battered by this, and one of the key players in this disaster was Rakesh Saxena, and he had his mate Tim Gatland helping him along with a few other things. Saxena himself is a colourful character, to put it mildly, an Indian financier. He was involved in all sorts of murky deals in Africa. He was also involved with the English mercenary firm called Sandline, who was sort of rent-a-coup. If you wanted to have a coup, you called Sandline. He had touched on some of their deals. And he was also, as I recently found out, involved with some of the principals running the boiler room scams, either the scams where you offered shares in a company that either doesn't exist or it's a complete con. These boiler room scams have been with us for a while, and Saxena's close mates and occasional business partners were some of the principals in these things, and they were flourishing from the mid-90s through to the early 2000s, ripping hundreds of millions of dollars out of investors around Southeast Asia, the UK, Europe, and in Australia. They tended to leave the US alone because of the reach of the US securities investigators. If you defrauded a US citizen, all of a sudden you had the US government chasing you, so they decided it was prudent not to do that. Saxena had all these sleazy, dodgy mates, basically. Now, Gatland was running around Bangkok. He was purporting, I'm just going to a couple of my notes here, by the way. He had a company running in Bangkok, which, according to one of the people involved in that company, a young Australian bloke who was working, inveigled by Gatland to work there for a year. He took a year's leave away from his post in foreign affairs. This young chap said, and I quote here, that Gatland channeled extraordinary sums of money through his bank accounts. And he said, there would have been more than 46 million paid into my bank account over the course of 1996. 96 is the year when Gatland left, or Gatland disappeared. Gatland was sort of, and I'm going through a couple of notes here, Gatland was bragging about the things he could do in town, and Bangkok was pretty wild back in those days. And the Sydney Morning Herald reported, years after I'd done the story, that in 1996, Gatland lent, bribed, and bullied and bluffed his way around Bangkok, telling friends of his involvement in smuggling tanks and helicopters from Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia. He said that he also had links to the international underground plutonium trail, the plutonium trade, which may have just been bullshit. What that brag about plutonium did was to get the CIA on his case, and I remember when we were doing our story, we were having some interesting conversations with people who wouldn't identify themselves, but they were from the Langley, Virginia area in the US. They're also FBI investigators and a few other dodgy types that were running around. It was a very interesting investigation for a journalist. I learned a lot very, very quickly. Now, Gatland was getting very hot, very hot. He had the Americans chasing him and his dodgy mates who were probably also having a look to him because he'd failed to deliver when they'd given him money. Gatland, around about mid-November, disappeared. And the story about that, his disappearance, is intriguing. There is one consistent thread in the story, that he was last seen by witnesses, if nothing else, outside or adjacent to the Dusatani Hotel in Bangkok. Now, this is a venerable 5-star in that city. It's around about 10-minute walk tops to Pat Pong Road, which then was the reddest of red light districts in the world. Now, I'm just going back to a note here. There are a couple of schools of thought. One is that he was last seen by his driver, and he had a permanent driver, which in those days in Bangkok was handy because there was no SkyTrain because it had failed. So you had a driver set up with radio, telephone, all that sort of stuff in the background. Now, his driver said that he last saw him around about 10:15 p.m. on Sunday, November the 10th, 1996. And that was at the Dusatani Hotel. And that time, Gatland had with him a change of clothes, a gun, and $30,000 in cash. Now, another source that we bumped into around the traps said that Gatland was seen leaving the Dusatani Hotel that same night, and he was in the company with two big Thai blokes, but they all seemed to be on very, very good terms. So he wasn't being dragged out. He was leaving quite voluntarily. Now, Gatland hasn't been seen since. No one's got a dollar of their money back so far. The story is, and there are a couple of things. Not long after we did the story, our reporter Margot O'Neill got a tip completely out of the blue, saying that Western intelligence agencies had believed that Gatland was in fact alive, well, and hiding out in Eastern Europe. Quite reasonable, considering some of the people that he may have bumped into that still liked him. Rakesh Saxena didn't have a lot of luck, unfortunately. So the only luck, I suppose, that Rakesh Saxena had around at this time is that when everything hit the fan in Thailand, Gatland disappeared, and the Thais had realised that they needed to do something active. He was, in fact, in Europe at the time and decided not to go back to Bangkok and instead ended up in Canada. Now, he fought extradition by the Thais there for years, and eventually about 2012, I think, the Canadians gave up and he was extradited back to Thailand. He's been in jail in Bangkok now until late 2024, hence my interest in this story. And in late 2024, the Thai government, he received a pardon from the king after spending about 12 years behind bars, and was last seen being bundled into a car, and the Indian government were in charge of taking him back to India. They have declined to comment when I've chased them. In fact, they just haven't said a word at all. But a couple of years ago, just before Rakesh Saxena was imprisoned, he gave one interview. And in that interview, he said that he believed that, he knew that Gatland was still alive and that Gatland was hiding out somewhere. And in that interview, Saxena said, and I'll quote here, "There comes a time when you've got to take your money and run." This is what Rakesh Saxena said. He said he actually met Gatland in the Ritz-Carlton in Vancouver, the Four Seasons Hotel in Vancouver some years ago. And at that time, Gatland was wearing glasses. He had a new hairstyle and was using a brand spanking new name. Sorry about that, I'll get that right. I'll go through that again. Saxena said, "There comes a time when you have to take your money and run." And he said he met Gatland at the Four Seasons Hotel in Vancouver. Gatland was wearing dark glasses, had a new hairstyle, and using a brand spanking new name. And this is not long after he disappeared from Bangkok. So the curiosity of this story is Tim Gatland still alive and living a pretty stylish lifestyle? By now he'd be around about mid-60s, I suppose. Or did he meet his maker in Bangkok and has never been found? It is an intriguing story. The person who probably holds the key to it still is Rakesh Saxena, which is why I'm still chasing him to see if he would like to refresh his recollections from so many years ago. If I hear any more about this bizarre story, the disappearance of Tim Gatland, I'll update you. Thank you.